What is the Fiesta? Today let's talk about the Fiesta, which occupies the last third of the book and provides an important context for the development of the characters and the tensions between them. Fiesta was one of the original titles, The Sun Also Rises. It was the title under which the book was issued in Britain. But first, let's take a step back and just recapitulate really briefly the influence of World War I on the characters of the novel. Well, we've said that Robert Cohn is not part of that. He didn't fight in the war, is not affected by the war. Jake Barnes, of course, did, severely affected by the war, and his set of values, I think, in as much as he has a clear set of articulated values, has been shaped by the war. Mike Campbell, well, we're told various stories about his war experience, about how he is a bankrupt, and I think we should think about that in the sort of the largest sense. He's a financial bankrupt, but perhaps also a spiritual or moral bankrupt. Brett Ashley, we're told, has been deeply affected by the war. She lost her one true love there. She married Lord Ashley, who would sleep with his service revolver. So she was, in a sense, at gunpoint during that relationship. And then we have a minor character they call Harris, Wilson Harris. He's the man they meet on the fishing trip. And he says, and I think sounds like a throwaway line, but it's actually quite significant. He's delighted by their company and enjoys being with them and drinking with them, utilizing with them, as they say. He says, "I've not had much fun since the war." And I think that speaks to, a whole generation of the survivors of the war who are struggling to find meaning, significance, pleasure, and a reason really to find value in life, to find meaning in life since World War One. Well, if there are sets of values in the novel, they have something to do with the importance of Pedro Romero and what he represents. Now, what's disastrous in the latter part of the novel is that Pedro Romero gets mixed up with Brett Ashley. He steps outside the narrow, restricted, but significant world of bullfighting to mix with the foreigners, the cosmopolitan set, the expatriates. Montoya and others strongly disapprove of this. Montoya says he ought to stay with his own people. And I think it's worth noting the place of the bullfight within Spanish culture here. We're told by Hemingway that there's no Spanish word for the bullfight. There's something about the bullfight that resists translation. You have to be part of that culture, part of that afición or passion to understand the bullfight and its significance. Pedro, we're told, seems a minor detail, but he smokes cigars. He's a young man, he's only 18, but he smokes cigars. It was part of his system of authority, we're told. And I think that's a useful phrase to hang on to, because Pedro, through his bullfighting, through his behavior, through his resistance to pain when he's beaten by Robert Cohn, he has a system of authority. Think about what happens to Cohn after he's beaten Pedro Romero. He is somehow destroyed by that. Pedro Romero keeps getting hit, but keeps getting up again. And the fact that he keeps getting up again somehow defeats Robert Cohn. So that's where the system of authority lies. It's innate, it's intrinsic to him, it's part of his position within a culture that values bullfighting, values what it represents. And bullfighting is particularly valuable because it can't be faked like the passion that it inspires. And we see that in the contrast between Belmonte and Romero. Belmonte is something of a dark, tragic figure who is in decline, and Romero is the up-and-coming, brilliant new bullfighter. Pedro Romero had the greatness. He loved bullfighting, and I think he loved the bulls, and I think he loved Brett. That's an interesting set of equivalences: the love of bullfighting, the love of the bulls, the love of Brett. Somebody at one point asks him, "Well, how can you love the bulls? You kill them." And he says, "They're my friends, but I kill them so they won't kill me." And we might think about the relevance of that in his relationship with Brett and the ways in which he tries to change her. We'll come on to that in a moment, or rather in the next lecture. Now, what is the fiesta? The fiesta, it's an event in Spanish culture. It's very old. It has a distinctive place within the primarily agrarian economy of Spain. We're told that it draws in people, certainly it draws in the foreigners, the tourists, and this is still true, I believe, but it also draws in people from the surrounding countryside. People leave the rather dull life of work on the farm to come to the fiesta. And the fiesta, over 7 days, 7 days of kind of drunken excess, a kind of madness, letting off of steam and so on. It's also a religious ceremony, of course, though we don't get a strong sense of that perhaps in the novel. It's also a revaluation of values, or an abandonment of traditional values. At the beginning of the fiesta, money, we're told, still had a definite value in hours worked and bushels of grain sold. Farmers, of course, have to be very conscious of that. But late in the fiesta, it would not matter what they paid nor where they bought. So value, the value that makes a certain amount of money equivalent to a certain amount of labor, a certain amount of grain, is overthrown. Value gets lost in excess. And that's part, I think, of the appeal of the fiesta. It challenges the traditional system of values, both literal monetary values and spiritual values, because behavior begins to change through the course of the fiesta. Even reality, it's suggested, might lose its sway. Everything became quite unreal finally, and it seemed as though nothing could have any consequences during the fiesta. Well, we normally make our way through the world in an awareness of consequences. That's very important in terms of planning rational behavior, our rational response to things, and in terms of our sort of, moral reckoning with the world. We have to know what it means to behave in a certain way, why we should behave one way rather than another. But it seems that the fiesta throws all that out as well. One part of it, of course, is the running of the bulls. In Pamplona, they release the bulls, and the bulls go charging through the streets on their way to the bull ring for the fights. And it's traditional, it's part of the event of the fiesta that ordinary people, not bullfighters, ordinary people will run in front of the bulls. They'll take this risk to participate, as it were, to become part of the danger, the madness of the bullfighting. Now, in the novel, of course, we're told about one person, one ordinary farmer, who is gored by a bull, badly cogito, as the waiter says to Jake, all for sport, all for pleasure. He says this dismissively. We learn from the newspaper, he was 28 years old, had a farm, a wife, and 2 children. So he's thrown that responsibility overboard for sport, for pleasure, as the waiter says disapprovingly. It's probably important to remember that not everybody in this context values the bullfighting in the same way. The waiter seems to see it in a quite sort of rational and pragmatic way, that it's actually, tremendously destructive and stupid. But of course, that's not how the people who are actually caught up in the madness of the fiesta see it. They overthrow those sort of rational reckonings with reality. The other thing about bullfighting, I think, that's important, it has this aesthetic value, but in the novel we're also invited to think about it metaphorically, that bullfighting, in some sense, has this microcosm of perhaps of the reckoning of life itself with the primal things that run through life, death, sexuality, and so on, things that can't be rationally understood necessarily, but must be reckoned with inevitably. Life from this perspective, and I think this is perhaps what Hemingway would say about it, life is a tragic thing. It involves reckoning with death, it involves irrationality, and bullfighting provides an aesthetic way of reckoning with that, a way of understanding human life in the context of death. There are more specific and detailed, concrete ways in which we're invited to think about bullfighting as a metaphor for the interaction of the characters. Hence, for example, the bulls and the steers. A steer is a bull that's been castrated before reaching sexual maturity, and the bulls calm down when they're among the steers. When they're isolated, then they go into this tremendously violent behavior that is part of the actual bullfight. But the characters themselves point out the analogy. Mike Campbell says, "Tell me, Robert, why do you follow Brett around like a poor bloody steer?" It's an interesting reversal here, because within this analogy, Brett would be the bull and Robert would be the castrated male. So the fact that he follows her around the way a steer follows around the bull presents him in a very poor light. He's emasculated by Brett. Robert Cohn sees things a little differently. He uses a classical analogy. He talks about Brett as Circe. Circe is the sorceress in the Odyssey, who turns men into swine. But again, we've got an animal analogy there, steers or swine. We might also think about Robert Cohn's violence. There's a moment where Jake tells us that bulls fight like boxers. They have rights and lefts. Cohn's boxing skills, which up until this point have been kept in the ring, now erupt outside, and he beats various people. He beats Mike, he beats Jake, and he beats, of course, Pedro Romero. He was so sure that Brett loved him, he was going to stay, and true love would conquer all. Robert Cohn is holding on to a set of values that seem outmoded here. His sort of romantic notion of the way life should be doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And I think this fits with a notion that value and language are connected. A series of terms, we're told elsewhere in Hemingway's work, particularly in A Farewell to Arms, and this is a very common perception, I think, among writers of the lost generation, writers during the war as well. Abstract words such as glory, honour, courage, or hallow were obscene beside the concrete numbers of regiments and the dates. These big words, glory, honour, courage, etc., sacrifice, don't hold water after World War I. They're seen as lies that have been used to send people off to war and to die. What those coming out the other side of World War I can hang on to are concrete details. Now we might wonder, and I think this is something we'll talk about in the next lecture, whether love is similarly devalued. Has love lost its meaning? Has it become obscene too? Well, I'll leave that question with you.